The recording is underway.
Okay, well, welcome everybody to chapter 14 of Romans. This is March 3rd. I feel like this is the Council on World Affairs. They're announcing we're in room 416 of Humanities, and so an opening prayer. God, you were present in the making of the heavens of the earth. You have revealed your beauty in creation and inspired the book that we are now about to study. Please help us now as we read together. Take us deeper into understanding about you and your love for us. Amen.
Amen.
So I think it's sometimes useful to kind of step back for a second and remind us of how we got here. It's generally acknowledged that this letter was written by Paul while he was in Corinth. He was there for several years. And this would have been sometime in the early 50s. And of course, by the end of the 50s, Paul was in Rome dead. So the previous decade was spent establishing churches throughout the Mediterranean. He had great plans after Corinth. In fact, one of the motivations for writing the letter to Romans was part of his fundraising for his mission to Iberia, which unfortunately never happened. So, of course, in those days, there were no postal roads. There was no email or fax. So how do you get your thoughts from one country to another? And as we'll see in chapter 16, where Paul goes into great length about who the courier was, we who read ahead know that this was Phoebe, who was a prominent figure in the Church of Corinth. She is referred to in language that comes to us as a deacon. So in many ways, she was perhaps the first deacon. And she's not just carrying a written document. She's going to give a performance. There are upwards of a half dozen house churches in Rome, and she will go to each of them and she will perform Paul's words for them and probably rehearse them with Paul, along with dramatic pauses and gestures and everything that goes into making a powerful performance. So Paul has never been to Rome at this time, so how does he know about what's going on there? The conjecture is that he got his information from a couple that we met in our study of Acts. That would be Priscilla and Aquila. They spent time together in Corinth and would have filled Paul in on who was who and what was going on. So how did they come to that knowledge? Well, they were in Rome, and with many other Roman Jews, they were expelled under the Emperor Claudius. I'm conjecturing that it was in the rule of Nero, Claudius's nephew, I believe, that the Jews returned to Rome. Now, it's likely that not everybody left. Just as with the Babylonian captivity, not all the Jews left Jerusalem. It was the elite. What portion of the Roman Jews left, I have no idea. But presumably there was a cadre, maybe keeping a very low profile, but who remained in Rome. So that's kind of the background. When we get to chapter 16 in a couple of weeks, we'll get a much broader biography of Phoebe from Paul as he introduces her to the Roman community. So chapter 14 is has many themes, but probably a central one is that there are tensions in the Christian community in Rome, just as there were tensions in all of the Christian communities. And that's what Paul generally writes about. In Galatians, in In other letters, he's talking, and in Corinthians, he's talking about specific problems that have come to his attention. It's not clear that that's the case in Romans. And so he talks about problems that exist throughout the Christian development, the Christian evolution throughout the Mediterranean. And the chief one is the tension between a group that Paul characterizes as the weak and the strong. Now, it may be that these terms are something that Paul just made up, a literary construct, or it may be that these were real terms being used in the house churches at that time. But it seems that when Paul talks about the weak, he's talking about those who are weak in faith because they are pulled in multiple directions. And these are chiefly those who come to Christianity from the Jewish tradition. And so they observe Torah, which is not easy, and Ren can give us a dissertation on the 600 plus rules that observant Jews were required to follow. And so to be an observant Jew and a Christian is a tough lot. And there are often contradictory elements there. And Paul is characterizing the strong as those from the Greek or Gentile tradition. So they don't have this internal tension. Their belief is a new one. It's not overriding an older conflicted one. Now, again, is this a binary, Manichaean, black or white? Probably not. And not all of the Jews would be considered weak. And I pose a question we might take up at the end. How would Paul consider himself? He was a Jew. He was a Pharisee. Did he consider himself to be among the weak or the strong? Now, Paul's mission throughout Acts and in the letters is that of a church planter. And in all of the communities, he's talking about mixed groups. And sometimes it's this Jewish Gentile conflict, sometimes it's others, but always the problem of reconciling, different traditions within this emerging church. Now, McKnight, which is one of the sources we've been using, I've also obtained a copy of Timothy Luke Johnson's commentary on Romans. But McKnight concludes that the weak are Jewish based on a number of factors. One was that there are both Jewish and Gentile names mentioned in Romans, especially in Romans 15, although the Gentiles were the majority. And the Jews of Rome were known for their dietary restrictions. And so Paul makes the point throughout Romans 14. And let me step back for a second. We talk about these chapter divisions. These were alien to Phoebe. This was one long letter, and it was not divided into chapters. It was not divided into verses, but the tradition that comes down to us has it in that form. And so Paul extensively quotes from Old Testament sources, to emphasize the inclusion of the whole world that the Old Testament, especially Isaiah, pointed to in the direction of the Hebrew faith that would eventually branch off into the Christian faith. So we mentioned that the Jews were famous for their dietary restrictions. One of the, briefly head-scratching lines in 14 is that Paul talks a lot about table hospitality and dietary restrictions. Also talks about ways of viewing the days of the week, that some are more sacred than others. Pretty clearly referring to that Jewish Gentile split. But why vegetables? Why does that make sense? Well, a couple of the authors suggest that this goes back to the idea that often the meat for sale in the markets of Rome had been slaughtered in observance of Roman rule and dedicated to Roman deities, not slaughtered the way that observant Jews would do it. And so one way to avoid that conflict for a Jew, even a Jewish Christian, is just to avoid meat. Therefore, since the wrapper doesn't say what practices were used in its slaughter, when it shows up on the buffet, you just avoid the meat. Presumably, that's what the vegetable comment is all about. The conflicts could be quite vehement, and since shared table, these are, after all, house churches, where the meal was probably an important part of it, and everybody brought something. These very strongly held beliefs about what was clean and unclean, could make table hospitality very difficult. And Paul is trying to overcome that. So he makes the point that Christ make, and that Peter had in his dream, the whole idea that there are no unclean animals. Everything in creation is clean and acceptable to people to consume. And so how do you overcome this conflict? Now, the source that I'm generally using for my notes here, McKnight, suggests that this was especially vehement in Rome. Other authors disagree. They look at the disagreements over circumcision that appear in some of the other letters, and those were really ugly. And Paul comes away in some cases saying, let them mutilate themselves. I wash my hands in this foolishness. I would suggest that it was less down and dirty in Rome. Real problems that had to be overcome, but not quite as nasty as in some others. Now, Paul brings up the idea of privilege and power in talking about reconciling these groups, and suggests that both groups have some of each, but there's a preponderance between the weak and the strong. Excuse me. That the privilege, my wife enters.
Water.
Oh, thank you. Suggests that the privilege chiefly lies with the Jewish community. And what's their privilege? The privilege of being the people of the covenant. That, we're the ones who got the first deal, and you Christians are Johnny-come-latelys. So they claim that privilege, and as a result of that privilege, they have some contempt for the Gentile Christians. Now, what about power? Well, again, the Jewish community in Rome had been sent away. Those who remained were in the shadows. Some are recently returned. So by far, the power lies with the Gentile Christians in status and probably in money too. And Paul wants to see these groups reconciled. He wants to see the powerful empower the weak. He wants to see the privilege regard with favor the Johnny-come-latelys. And that's really the operative phrase that concludes these notes, is to say that everybody is welcome at the table. And really all of Romans can be summarized in that. So there's my 15-minute down and dirty on Romans 14. I've got some questions, but before we get to that, I just appreciate your comments.
Ted, you need to stop the recording.
Thank you, reminder.
Uh-huh.